Now that we have a better understanding of how UVs and the UV mapping process is going to work, let's look at some big picture strategies that will help us define how we can unwrap and create UV islands for the entirety of my little bear model here. Now, this is the really challenging part inside of our 3D art production pipeline, is that we have to take this three-dimensional shape and unwrap it and create UVs so that they all lie perfectly flat in a two-dimensional space. If you take a way big step back and look at it, imagine this bear or your model kind of like a birthday present. It's all nice and wrapped up in a three-dimensional cube or whatever the shape of the birthday present is. And now we have the job of taking that completed structure and very carefully peeling back all the tape on the wrapping paper and lying that wrapping paper down flat on a tabletop so that we can create a custom pattern that's going to go on the wrapping paper itself. Since every model is going to be a little bit different, there is no silver bullet solution that's going to allow us to automatically unwrap this model and get the best result. We only have some guiding strategies and some principles that will help us figure out where we can divide our mesh and so that we can get the best UV production. And I think that word division is really important. We're not going to physically unlink the polygons. These UVs are their own separate item inside of our 3D art pipeline. And we're going to have a whole bunch of them. We're going to separate the entire model into a whole series of parts and pieces so that we can cleanly and efficiently lie them flat on top of our digital tabletop, if you will. Once they're on that digital tabletop, then we can go back in and paint on them with our two-dimensional painting tools over inside of Substance Painter. So here are a few of the strategies that I always employ when I'm defining where I want my UVs to go and how I'm going to create them inside the mesh itself. The first thing that I look for are the high value areas in the mesh itself. Almost 9 times out of 10, it's going to be the character's face. We make an emotional connection with our character's faces, so we want to make sure that the texture on this part of the model is perfect, like as perfect as we possibly can make. So we want to make sure that we reduce the visual impact of any sort of seam that's going to be in this area. Whenever we have 2 different UV islands inside of our mesh, we're going to produce a seam, a natural division point between one area and another. At times, this seam can be noticeable, so we want to try to make sure that we're reducing its impact on the total texture that we're going to apply to this character. Seams are part of our business. It's something that we can't avoid, right? It's just part of the process itself. But we can intelligently design all of our UVs so that the seams are not as noticeable. Now, if you look at the topology here, and I apologize, I know it's very difficult to see on the screen recording, I have this wonderful loop right around the neck that will serve as a nice natural barrier between the UVs for the head and the UV chunks and islands that we're going to find in the back or on the body of our bear itself. What this allows us to do is to unwrap this in a way that we're going to have one island for the face itself, and that's a good place to begin. We want to have, at the very least, as few seams as we can on the face. We don't want anything getting in the way of our audience making that emotional connection. So the face is a high value area of our character. Now, in addition, the face also presents some problems because we have some areas in here that are pretty complex and the flow of the geometry has fundamentally shifted. If you think about the flow of the geometry rolling across the face, for the most part, it's going from the right side of the screen all the way, kind of down over to the left side of the screen. But then if we go into areas like the ear, we have a very sharp change in orientation in the polygonal flow. It was going from right to left. On the ear, now it's going up and down. So this may be another good area for us to put a natural seam. And luckily for us, we have a great poly loop just sitting right there at the top that defines the boundary of the ear. A natural place for a UV island to be created and a seam to be placed. And specifically, I think I'm kind of spotting these in here. This edge loop is really where I want to have my UV seam show up. That's a good place to go. It's going to be very difficult to see. There's going to be a pretty heavy texture applied to this area of the mesh itself, so my audience is probably unlikely going to see any seam in there. It'll make the quality of this UV island much, much higher. The quality of our UVs, the lack of distortion on the UV islands themselves is going to have a direct impact on how these two-dimensional textures are going to be placed and reproduced on the model itself. So the efficiency and the cleanliness of our UVs is really important. Having multiple UV islands makes the quality of all of those UV islands skyrocket pretty quick. Okay, so we've talked about maybe a UV island for the face, maybe one for each of the ears. Well, what about the legs and the body itself? Now, luckily for us, we have some great topology on this mesh that produces a natural location for all of these seams. And I think right in there, maybe even on the back one, this one right there. Oops, I double clicked on accident. There we go. These are great locations for UV seams, right in here. It's a natural division between the body of the bear and the legs of the bear. We want to try to reduce the impact of these seams as we can. Is there a place that we can hide them, if you will, inside the mesh itself? Sometimes we have to be sneaky with the application of all of these UV seams when we're UV mapping to reduce the impact of these seams. Can we put them underneath the bear or in an area that our audience isn't naturally going to see? Is there going to be a crease or a fold or a wrinkle in this part of the mesh that will hide the seam? It's a good strategy. Can we place them in areas that are naturally going to be deformed? In the sculpture, or the sculpture is only ever going to look like this, but this is not the final pose of the character. I'm going to have the legs up, and I'm going to pose it a little bit over in Blender to make it really look more three-dimensional, to make it an engaging kind of final piece of artwork. So there's going to be some deformation that I'm going to have with the rigging tools in Blender to give me some additional folds in the shoulder and the hip area. A great place to put a seam. Now, luckily for us, we also have some great symmetrical geometry. When I was retopologizing this, I ensured that I had a center line for my mesh. And it's right there. I apologize. I know it's hard to see in the video, but there's a center line that runs down the middle of the bear, going all the way underneath. Well, this center line underneath is a great, fantastic place to hide a UV seam. And I'm going to have the body seam be right there in the middle. We're not going to have just one UV island for the entire mesh. We're going to have probably 8 or 9 of them when we're all said and done. So we got to start figuring out where we want all of these chunks to go. In addition, thinking of some other chunks, down here at the bottom of our feet, once again, the flow of our polygons change quite dramatically. They're going north to south, and then when they get down to the feet, they start going east and west, left and right. Whenever there's a massive change in our polygonal flow, that's a good location for a seam. The computer's going to have a hard time trying to figure out how to smooth and flatten all of these polygons in a two-dimensional form when their fundamental polygonal flow shifts by 90 degrees. Small little polygonal flows like we see up here, this is fine. The computer's not going to have a hard time flattening that out, because even though they're warped and a little bit bent, they're not nearly as bent as what we have down here at the bottom. So these are some great strategies that you should employ and start to think about when we're starting to figure out and experiment with the correct location of all of these UV islands and these three-dimensional UV seams on the model itself. Keep in mind, we're going for cleanliness and efficiency in our UVs. We're going to have a whole bunch of islands, and we need to figure out where each one of these islands is going to begin and end to ensure that the 2D texture is produced correctly across the model.